The air inside the diner was thick with the scent of fried food and cigarette smoke, but even thicker was the unspoken rule that the man standing at the counter was breaking just by being there. James knew at the moment the bell jingled above the door, and every white face turned toward him, eyes narrowing, lips tightening. He had walked into Woolworth's once before, back when he was a boy, tugging at his mother's hand, asking why the counter was lined with stools that he wasn't allowed to sit on. Now, at 23, with broad shoulders and calloused hands from working long days at the factory, he wasn't asking anymore. He was here to take a seat. The waitress, a young blonde woman with a nervous glance, hovered behind the counter, clutching her notepad as if it were a lifeline. She didn't speak, just flicked her gaze to the manager, a stout man in a grease-stained apron who stepped forward, wiping his hands with deliberate slowness on the rag hanging from his waist. "We don't serve your kind here," he said, voice low but firm, the weight of history pressing into each word. James swallowed the anger that rose up in his chest like bile, glancing at the row of white patrons staring at him with thinly veiled hostility. His heart pounded, but his feet remained planted. "I'll have a coffee," he said, his voice steady. The waitress flinched, the manager's jaw tightened, and somewhere in the back of the diner, a chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I said, we don't serve your kind," the manager repeated, louder now, and James caught the shifting movement of a uniformed police officer outside the window, slowly making his way toward the entrance. Fear clawed at his gut, but he didn't move. He thought of Emmett Till, the boy they had beaten and drowned just last year for something as small as a whistle. He thought of his father, who had always warned him not to make trouble, who had once driven him home in silence after being forced off the sidewalk by a group of white men. He thought of his younger sister, Ruthie, who asked every night why their school had torn books and broken desks when the white school down the road gleamed like something out of a dream. "Sir, you need to leave," the manager said, voice harder now, his patience thinning like the cheap coffee he served. James knew he had only seconds to decide, to stay, to fight, to flee. The door creaked open, the police officer stepping inside, his belt jangling with authority. And in that moment, James had to choose, stand his ground and risk everything, or walk away and carry the weight of silence on his back forever. James felt the heat of every gaze burning into him, the unspoken threat in the air tightening around his throat like an invisible noose, but he did not move. The officer took another step forward, resting his hand on the club at his belt, a slow and deliberate motion meant to remind James of his place, meant to make his body remember what had been done to men like him for far less than asking for a cup of coffee. The waitress had taken a step back, her eyes darting between James and the officer, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped the notepad she no longer needed. The manager shifted, crossing his arms over his broad chest, and behind James, the murmur of white patrons grew louder, restless, angry, voices dripping with the kind of hatred that had been passed down like a family heirloom, inherited through whispers at the dinner table, through Sunday sermons that preached love but never for people like him. James knew this moment would decide everything. If he sat down, if he stayed, he would be making a statement, one that would not be forgotten, not by the men in this diner, not by the officer watching him like a predator sizing up its prey, not by his own people who might hear of what he had done and wonder if maybe, just maybe, things could be different. His mother's voice echoed in his head, warning him, pleading with him to be careful, to be smart, to live to see another day, because the world had never been kind to a black man who thought he could stand on equal ground with a white man. His father's silence spoke louder, a lifetime of endured humiliation compressed into the heavy, weary sighs of a man who had never had the privilege of raising his voice, who had learned to bow his head and keep walking, who had done everything he could to ensure his son wouldn't have to do the same. And yet, here James stood, staring down the inevitable, his pulse hammering, his body torn between terror and defiance, between survival and dignity. The officer cleared his throat. "Son, I'm not going to ask you again," he said, his voice laced with condescension, with amusement, as if he had already decided how this was going to end. James inhaled sharply, his fingers clenching into fists at his sides before he forced them open again, before he slowly, deliberately, pulled out the stool in front of him and lowered himself onto it. The scrape of metal against the tile floor cut through the murmurs, through the thick silence that followed, a sound so small yet so loud it seemed to shake the room. The officer's hand tightened around his club. The manager's face darkened. Someone in the back cursed under their breath. James kept his eyes forward. "Coffee," he said again, his voice level, his body still, but inside, his heart was a drum pounding against his ribs, a warning, a war cry, a prayer. The waitress hesitated, looking to the manager, who shook his head once, a quick, sharp motion. "Get him out!" He barked at the officer, and before James could react, before he could move, a rough hand clamped onto his shoulder, yanking him backward with a force that nearly sent him sprawling. Gasps rippled through the diner, not in sympathy, not in outrage, but in anticipation, in the sick thrill of seeing a man put back in his place. James twisted, his balance slipping as the officer's grip tightened, his other hand reaching for the baton. "You were warned," the officer growled, and then the first strike came, sharp and sudden against James's ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. Pain exploded through his side, but he refused to cry out. Another strike, this time against his shoulder, forcing him to his knees. He heard laughter, the scrape of chairs as people shifted to get a better view. He saw the waitress flinch, saw the flicker of something, guilt, maybe, or fear, pass across her face before she looked away. He saw the manager smirk. And then he saw the door burst open, a rush of footsteps, and suddenly there were more voices, voices that did not belong to the men who had been watching, voices that shouted his name, voices that demanded justice, voices that pushed forward as the officer turned, startled, his grip loosening just enough for James to stumble to his feet. A sea of black faces filled the entrance, men and women who had been watching from outside, who had been waiting, who had seen enough. "Let him go," someone shouted. "You ain't got no right," another voice called. The officer hesitated, his hand still gripping the baton, but for the first time, James saw uncertainty in his eyes, saw the fear of a man who had never expected to be outnumbered, who had always relied on silence and submission to do his work for him. And in that moment, James realized something. He was not alone. He had never been alone. The weight of his people, of their pain, their struggles, their hope, was behind him, lifting him up, giving him the strength to straighten his spine even as his ribs ached, even as blood trickled from his lip. The officer took a step back. The manager cursed under his breath. The waitress looked away. And James, with all the strength left in his body, with the fire still burning in his chest, turned back to the counter, to the empty stool, to the space he had fought for, and sat down. "Coffee," he said one last time, and this time, the silence that followed was not the silence of fear, but of something else entirely. The silence stretched, a tense, suffocating moment that seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a fire that had just been doused. The officer, his baton still clenched in his hand, didn't move. He was watching James closely, sizing him up, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. The other patrons, those few who had dared to watch, kept their eyes on the ground, unwilling to make eye contact, unwilling to become part of this moment. But outside, the crowd continued to grow. More black men and women had gathered in front of the diner, some of them shouting for justice, others just standing there, holding the weight of history in their eyes. The officer's breath was ragged, and he looked like he was about to speak, to do something, but then, without warning, he turned, muttering something under his breath. The manager glanced nervously at the scene unfolding outside, his face pale, his knuckles white from gripping the edge of the counter. He looked from the officer to James and back again, as though he couldn't decide what to do, how to make it go away. The waitress, her eyes filled with quiet tears, didn't move. She didn't offer the coffee. She didn't say a word. And James, with his chest still heaving, still fighting against the pain that was now a constant ache, stayed where he was, staring straight ahead, focusing on the counter, trying to ignore the blood on his lip, trying to ignore the swelling in his side. For a moment, everything was still, and then, with a suddenness that felt like a release, the officer began to back away, his eyes flicking nervously toward the door, toward the crowd gathering outside. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low, but there was no conviction in it, no authority. It was the kind of threat a man makes when he's lost control, when the power he thought he had is slipping through his fingers. The officer turned and walked out, leaving behind the stench of his failure, leaving behind a room that was still, but for the tension that lingered like smoke. The manager watched him go, then quickly turned his attention back to James. You're not welcome here," he said, his voice shaking, but his eyes were filled with fear, not of James, but of the world outside, of the world that had been shifted just a little bit, just enough for things to feel different. The waitress, her hands trembling, placed a cup of coffee in front of James. She didn't look at him, didn't say anything, but the act itself, the quiet defiance, the unspoken gesture, spoke volumes. James stared at the cup, the steam rising from it like a prayer, like a symbol of everything that had led him to this moment. He didn't take the cup. He just sat there, silent, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him. He didn't know what was coming next. He didn't know if the world was going to be the same tomorrow, or if the men who had come here to watch him would come back, angrier, more determined. He didn't know if he was going to make it out of this town in one piece. But what he did know, what he had learned in the span of a few minutes, was that his fight wasn't over. It had just begun. The crowd outside had not dispersed, and though the officer had retreated, the tension in the air had not. It was thick, heavy, and James could feel it pressing on his chest, just like the baton's first strike. He could hear the murmurs from outside, the shouting, the calls for justice. He could hear the voices that had been raised for so long, the voices of men and women who had endured, who had survived, who had pushed back against the weight of history, and had never given up hope. That was the thing about history, James thought. It wasn't a static thing. It wasn't a line that stayed the same, a story that could be told only one way. History, like a river, shifted and flowed, breaking free of its banks when it needed to, carving out new paths, creating new landscapes. And in that moment, in that diner, in that small corner of the world, he had become part of that river. He had become part of the change. The coffee sat in front of him, still steaming, and for a long moment, he simply stared at it, unsure of what to do next. But then, slowly, carefully, he reached for the cup. He took a sip, the bitter warmth spreading through him like a reminder that he was alive, that he had made it through, that despite everything, he had not been broken. The waitress, watching him from behind the counter, met his gaze for a brief moment. There was something in her eyes, a quiet, unspoken understanding, and then she turned away, leaving him alone in the silence that followed the officer's departure. Outside, the voices continued, the crowd still gathered, but now, they were stronger, more determined. James could hear their calls for change, their demands for equality, for justice. He could hear the sound of something shifting, something that had been held down for so long finally breaking free. He knew this was only one small battle in a much larger war. He knew there would be more moments like this, more moments when he would have to choose between silence and defiance, between running and standing his ground. But in that moment, as the heat of the crowd outside washed over him, as the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the sweat on his skin, James knew one thing with certainty. He would never stop fighting. He would never let them break him. He would never let them take away his dignity. Not ever again. And with that thought, with that promise to himself, he stood up from the counter, walked out of the diner, and into the world that was slowly, but surely, beginning to change. James stepped out into the cool morning light with a quiet determination that belied the chaos of the previous night, his mind still echoing with the fervent cries of the crowd and the biting sound of sirens in the distance, And as he walked along the rain-soaked pavement, each step heavy with the memory of injustice and defiance, he could feel the pulse of change beginning to stir beneath the layers of oppression that had defined his life for so long. For in that moment the world, though still divided by centuries of prejudice, seemed to tremble with the possibility of transformation, and every face in the crowd he passed, some hardened by the weight of struggle, others still fragile with hope, spoke silently of the countless souls who had dared to raise their voices against a system that had long silenced them. And as he made his way through the narrow streets of the city, the sound of his footsteps mingled with the distant murmur of protesters and the soft hum of a radio broadcasting news of growing resistance, each note a promise that the fight for dignity was far from over, and the memory of that day in the diner, where he had refused to be broken by the cold cruelty of those in power, remained a beacon in his heart, urging him forward even as the shadows of his past threatened to overwhelm him, for he knew that every scar he bore, every bruise that marked his flesh, was a testament to his survival, a quiet act of defiance against a world that had once sought to erase him. And now, as the first hints of a new era shimmered in the early light, he could see that change was not just a distant dream, but a tangible force gathering momentum in the very streets he walked, a force born of the voices of those who had long been suppressed and fueled by the undeniable power of unity and hope. And with each step, the bitter memories of the officer's harsh words and the manager's sneers receded into the background, replaced by the vibrant, unyielding truth that his life, his struggle, and the love that had sustained him through every hardship were all part of a larger tapestry of resistance that refused to be undone. And as he reached a bustling intersection where a group of young activists gathered, their eyes alight with passion and their banners held high in a silent promise to reshape the future, James paused to absorb the scene, feeling the weight of generations in their determined faces. And in that moment, he realized that his battle was not a solitary one, but a shared endeavor that spanned time and transcended pain, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose swell within him, a vow that no matter how many obstacles lay ahead or how deep the scars of injustice ran, he would continue to fight for a world where every person could stand tall without fear, where the color of one's skin or the contours of one's body would no longer dictate one's destiny. And so, with the strength of those who had come before him and the hope of those who were yet to rise, James stepped forward into the light of a dawning day, his heart beating in rhythm with the drum of change, his eyes fixed on a future where every whisper of defiance, every silent act of love, would echo loudly enough to break the chains of a world built on hatred. And as the streets around him filled with the determined energy of progress, he embraced the uncertainty of the journey ahead, knowing that while the road would be long and fraught with peril, the spark of resistance he had ignited would grow into a blazing fire that could not be quenched. And thus, with one final deep breath, James moved forward, his spirit unyielding, his resolve unbroken, ready to face whatever came next in a world that was finally beginning to listen, finally beginning to see, finally beginning to change. James kept moving, the rhythmic sound of his footsteps blending into the pulse of the city around him, the scent of damp pavement mingling with the acrid smoke from distant protests, the air thick with the weight of something unspoken yet undeniable, a force that had been building for generations, pushing against the walls of segregation and injustice like a flood waiting to break free, and he knew that he was a part of that tide, a single drop in an ocean of voices refusing to be silenced, his mind replaying the events of the past days, like a reel of film unraveling too fast to stop, the sharp slap of a police baton against his ribs, the taste of blood in his mouth when he had refused to move from the diner counter, the whisper of his mother's voice warning him since childhood about the dangers of stepping out of line, about how the world would never let him be just a man, how he would always be seen as a threat, as something to be controlled. And yet despite everything, despite the bruises and the fear that still clenched like a fist around his heart, there had been something else too, something that burned hotter than the pain, an ember of defiance that refused to be extinguished. And as he turned the corner, he saw it in the faces of those who gathered in the streets, the young black men and women holding signs high above their heads, their eyes fierce with purpose, the white students who had joined them despite the threats, despite the risk of losing their families. their homes, their futures, standing shoulder to shoulder as if daring the world to try and tear them apart, and James felt something tighten in his chest, something raw and unnameable, a mix of pride and sorrow and longing, because he knew that this moment, this movement, was bigger than him, bigger than any single act of defiance, and yet it was also deeply, achingly personal, because for every step forward they took, there were still so many forces trying to drag them back. The police cars, prowling slowly at the edge of the crowd, the men in press suits watching from behind newspaper stands with narrowed eyes, the echoes of slurs hurled from passing vehicles, each word a wound, each sneer a reminder that hatred did not disappear overnight. And James thought about leaving, about slipping away into the anonymity of the alleyways, about finding some quiet corner of this city where he could breathe without the weight of history pressing against his ribs. But then he saw her, standing near the front of the protest, her dark eyes scanning the crowd with a mix of urgency and exhaustion, her hair pulled back in a defiant knot, her hands curled into fists at her sides, and something inside him lurched, because he had not seen Olivia since that night, since the police had dragged him from the diner, since she had been forced to watch with horror as they pressed his face into the pavement, her own voice hoarse from screaming his name, and for a moment he wasn't sure if he was imagining her, if his mind was playing some cruel trick. But then she turned, and their eyes met, and the world seemed to narrow to just that moment, just that connection, and he saw in her face everything he had been feeling, the rage and the grief and the terrible, impossible hope, and before he could think, before he could stop himself, he was moving toward her, the crowd pressing around him, voices rising in unison, demanding justice, demanding change, demanding to be heard, and then he was there, standing in front of her, close enough to see the tear tracks on her cheeks, the bruise on her wrist where someone had tried to pull her away, and she was looking at him like she wasn't sure if he was real, like she had convinced herself she would never see him again, and then, without a word, she reached for him, fingers trembling as they brushed against his, and in that moment, with the city erupting around them, with history shifting beneath their feet, James realized that no matter what happened next, no matter how many times they were knocked down, no matter how much the world tried to break them, they would keep standing, keep fighting, keep loving in the face of it all, because some things, some people, were worth the risk, worth the pain, worth everything. And as he laced his fingers through hers, as they turned together to face whatever came next, James knew that this was only the beginning. James squeezed Olivia's hand, as the shouts of the crowd rose higher, a chorus of anger and determination rolling like thunder through the streets, the signs held high above their heads declaring their right to exist, their right to be free, their right to sit at any counter, and drink from any fountain and walk through any door without fear of what waited on the other side. But even as they stood together, even as their bodies pressed close, James could feel the undercurrent of danger threading through the moment, the way the police lingered at the edges of the protest like vultures waiting for something to die, the way shopkeepers peered through their windows with a mix of contempt and unease, the way a group of young white men across the street watched them with narrowed eyes and curled lips, their bodies thrumming with the promise of violence, and James knew how quickly things could turn, how a single word or shove or gunshot could unravel everything. But still, he held Olivia's hand tighter, still, he stood his ground, because he had spent his whole life being told to step aside, to stay quiet, to accept the way things were, but he couldn't do it anymore, not after everything, not when the weight of his ancestors pressed against his shoulders, whispering that he had a duty to fight, to speak, to be more than the world had told him he could be, and beside him, Olivia was trembling, her breath shallow, her pulse quick beneath his fingertips, and he knew she was remembering the last time they had stood together like this, the night the police had slammed him against the pavement, the night she had tried to fight for him, the night she had been dragged away screaming his name, and he hated that she had to live with that memory, hated that she had learned so young what it meant to be powerless, but there was no room for fear now, no room for regret, only the steady drum of history moving forward, only the knowledge that they could not go back, only the certainty that this moment, this fight, was theirs to claim. And then, from the edges of the protest, a voice rang out, sharp and mocking, the word slicing through the air like a blade, a racial slur spat with a kind of venom that left no room for misunderstanding, and the crowd shifted, a ripple of tension moving through the sea of bodies, eyes darting toward the source of the insult, toward the group of men who stood with their arms crossed, smirking, daring someone to react, daring someone to give them the excuse they needed to strike. And James felt Olivia stiffen, felt the way her fingers twitched in his grip, and he turned to look at her, to silently remind her that this was what they wanted, that this was the trap. But before he could say anything, one of the men lunged, knocking a young black boy to the ground, his sign falling from his hands, skidding across the pavement, and the world seemed to freeze. The silence before the storm stretching impossibly thin, and then everything erupted at once, fists flying, bodies colliding, shouts turning to screams as the police surged forward, batons raised, tear gas canisters launched into the crowd, people scattering, running, falling, choking on smoke, and James grabbed Olivia, pulling her with him as they fought their way through the chaos, his only thought to get her out, to get her safe. But the streets were a battlefield now, the air thick with fear and defiance, the clash of resistance and oppression playing out in real time, and James knew there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And then, hands on his shoulders, rough and unyielding, a voice barking orders in his ear, the sickening crunch of a baton against bone, Olivia's scream splitting the night as he went down, pain exploding through his ribs, his vision blurring, and for a moment he thought this was it, that this was how it would end, another name added to the list of those lost to hatred, another body left bleeding in the streets. But then Olivia was there, shoving, clawing, fighting with everything she had, refusing to let them take him, refusing to let them erase him, and something inside him reignited, something stronger than pain, stronger than fear, and he pushed himself up, using every ounce of strength he had left, reaching for her, their fingers brushing, and then the world tilted, the weight of a dozen bodies crushing down on him, and everything went dark. James awoke to the sharp sting of dried blood cracking against his skin, to the cold, unrelenting hardness of a concrete floor pressing into his back, to the muffled sound of distant voices echoing through the steel bars that surrounded him like a cage, and for a moment, disoriented and aching, he couldn't remember how he had gotten here, but then it all came rushing back, the protest, the shouts, the fists, the snap of batons breaking flesh, the chaos swallowing them whole, Olivia's scream, cutting through the night like a blade, and his body jerked upright before his mind could stop it, his ribs screaming in protest, his breath catching in his throat as pain rippled through him like a shockwave. But he didn't care, he had to find her, had to know if she was safe, had to see her, and he turned his head, scanning the dimly lit cell, hard hammering against his bruised ribs. But she wasn't there, only a handful of other men, their faces shadowed and swollen, their eyes filled with the same weary rage that burned inside him, and before he could stop himself, he was on his feet, stumbling toward the bars, hands gripping the rusted metal, voice hoarse as he shouted her name, his desperation thick enough to drown in. But the only response was the sharp bark of a guard telling him to shut up, the slam of a baton against the bars making his teeth rattle, and he clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe, forcing himself to think, because panicking wouldn't help her. Panicking wouldn't get them out of here. Panicking wouldn't undo the nightmare that had already unfolded. And then, just as he was about to demand answers, just as he was about to let his fury consume him, a door creaked open in the distance, footsteps echoing through the corridor, and then he saw her, saw Olivia being dragged past his cell, her dress torn, her lips split, her wrists bound with rough rope, her head hanging low. But she was alive. She was breathing, and for a moment, that was enough. For a moment, the sight of her moving, the proof that they hadn't taken everything from him, steadied him. But then she lifted her head, her eyes locking onto his, and what he saw there shattered him, because there was no relief, no reassurance, only a silent warning, only the weight of a truth she couldn't speak. And before he could call out to her, before he could demand to know what they had done, she was gone, swallowed by the shadows. And the rage inside him flared so hot it threatened to consume him whole, because he knew what happened to black women in places like this. He knew what happened when they were taken behind closed doors, when their screams were smothered by the sound of laughter, and he slammed his fists against the bars, his fury a living, breathing thing inside him. But the guards only sneered, only chuckled, only shook their heads like they had seen this 100 times before, like they already knew how this would end, and James felt something inside him snap, because he refused to accept that, refused to let them win, refused to be another name carved into the stone of a forgotten grave, and so he forced himself to breathe, forced himself to think, forced himself to remember every story he had ever heard about men who had made it out of places like this, about men who had fought and clawed and refused to go quietly, and he knew he had to be one of them. Knew he had to be smart, because if he lost his temper, if he gave them a reason, he wouldn't make it out of here, and neither would Olivia, and so he stepped back, forcing his hands to unclench, forcing his expression to smooth, and he waited for the right moment, waited for the shift change, waited for the one guard who wasn't paying attention, and when that moment came, when the air was thick with silence, when the night stretched long and empty, James made his move, his heart pounding, his pulse roaring in his ears. Because he didn't care what it took, didn't care what he had to do. He was getting out of here, and he was taking Olivia with him. James pressed his back against the cold stone wall of the cell, his breath coming in quiet, measured exhales, as he listened to the distant sounds of boots scraping against concrete, the shuffle of keys, the low murmur of guards speaking in voices thick with boredom and certainty, the certainty that no one in these cells would fight back, that no one would dare try. But James wasn't like the others, wasn't willing to sit in the dark and wait for whatever punishment they had planned, because Olivia was somewhere beyond these walls, somewhere alone, somewhere suffering, and he could still see her eyes, still see the warning in them, still feel the weight of everything left unsaid, and he knew, deep in his bones, that whatever they had planned for her, it was happening now, or soon, and every second wasted was a second closer to losing her forever. So he forced himself to steady, forced himself to be patient, forced himself to wait for the moment when the night stretched long and quiet, when the guards became sluggish with routine, when their laughter faded into sleepy indifference, and when it came, when the silence settled over the jail like a thick fog, James moved, slipping his fingers into the small space between the bricks, feeling for the loose edge he had discovered earlier, heart thundering as he pried it free, revealing the small shard of metal he had hidden there, something rusted, something forgotten, but sharp enough to do what needed to be done, and he gripped it tight, wrapping his fingers around it as he waited, listening, counting the footsteps, mapping the rhythm of the patrol, and when the guard passed by his cell, when the keys jingled at his hip, James struck, arm flashing through the bars like a snake, the metal pressing into flesh, a strangled gasp, a body jerking back, and James wasted no time, reaching through, grabbing the keys, slipping them from the belt of the guard now crumpling to the floor. And he didn't stop to check if he was breathing, didn't stop to think about what he had just done, because there was no time for regret, no time for hesitation, only time to move, and he did, shoving the key into the lock, wrenching the door open, slipping into the hallway, pressing himself into the shadows as he listened, as he breathed, as he forced himself to be calm, to be careful, to be silent, and then he was moving past the cells, past the men who stirred in their sleep, past the ones who watched him with wide, knowing eyes, and then he reached the door, the one that led deeper inside, the one that led to Olivia, and he braced himself before he turned the handle, before he stepped into the dark, before he faced whatever waited on the other side, and when he saw her, when he saw the bruises blooming across her skin, the rope biting into her wrists, the fear in her eyes, something inside him shattered, something inside him burned. And before the man standing over her could react, before he could turn, before he could speak, James was on him, the rusted metal flashing, blood blooming, a choked gasp, a body hitting the ground, and then it was just him and Olivia, just the sound of their breathing, just the weight of what they had done, and she was looking at him, eyes wide, mouth parted, something like disbelief, something like relief, And then she was moving, and he was untying her wrists, and they were running through the halls, through the night, through the world that had tried to break them, and they didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't breathe until they were far away, until the lights of the town were distant glows against the horizon, until the only sound was the wind rushing through the trees, and then, only then, did Olivia turn to him, her fingers gripping his, her voice barely a whisper as she asked, "What now?" And James, breathless, bloody, alive, could only whisper back, "We keep running." James and Olivia kept running, the moonlight casting long shadows on the ground as they moved through the thickening darkness, their footsteps in sync, urgent, as if the world was closing in around them. The quiet hum of the night was broken only by the rush of air, the soft crackle of leaves beneath their feet, and the distant howls of dogs on a search. They knew they had little time. The world was unforgiving. The price for defiance had always been steep, and they had paid it with everything, his freedom, her safety, their future. And yet, there was something different now, something unspoken that hung between them in the cold air, something that made each step heavier but also lighter. They had escaped, but they had no illusion of victory, not yet. The weight of what had been left behind, the memories of the small town that had forced them to live in secrecy, to hide in fear, lingered in the back of their minds. James could still feel the sting of the look the sheriff had given him when they first crossed paths, the one that said everything about how his kind was expected to know their place, the one that made it clear that a black man, especially one in love with a white woman, was a threat. Olivia's grip on his hand tightened, and he knew she was thinking the same thing. Of all the places they had lived before this moment, of all the ways they had been shaped by a world that taught them to fear each other, to never cross those invisible lines. She had never meant for this to happen, never imagined that the fire between them would grow so fierce that it would force them both into the uncharted territory of escape, of leaving everything behind. But here they were. She was a woman whose name had meant something in that town, belonging to a family that had lived comfortably on the other side of those invisible lines, while his had always been the faces of people who were erased from history, whose lives had been reduced to footnotes, whose struggles were ignored or misunderstood. And yet, they had found each other. Against all odds, in the midst of so much hatred and fear, they had found each other, and for the first time James felt like he could breathe. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. They stumbled into a clearing, both gasping for air, their chests rising and falling in sync. The weight of the night pressed heavily against them, the sense of urgency laced with fear, but there was something more. There was the sound of their hearts racing together, the quiet space that had formed between their breaths, the peace that came with the silence of knowing they had each other. And in that silence, the question lingered, what now? What did the future look like when the past had tried to swallow them whole? Olivia turned to him, her eyes wide in the dark, her face framed by the light of the stars. "Do you think we can make it?" she whispered, her voice fragile, like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. James exhaled, the cold air biting his lungs, but there was no hesitation in his answer. "We have to," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos of the world that still loomed around them. "We'll make it because we're alive. And as long as we're alive, we have a chance." They sat there for a long while, just listening to the world around them, listening to the rhythm of their hearts, and in that stillness, something shifted. It was like they were two souls unburdened for the first time, no longer bound by the chains of a world that had told them their love was a crime. In the quiet, there was hope, fragile and fleeting, but undeniable. They didn't know what the future held. They didn't know if they could outrun the past or the consequences of their actions. But they had each other. And for that one precious moment, that was enough. They stood up together, hands still gripping each other tightly, as they began to walk again, knowing that the road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like a road they could travel together, a road that no one could take from them. And as they disappeared into the night, leaving behind the fear, the shame, and the world that had never accepted them, they knew one thing for certain: love, even in the face of so much hate, was the only thing that could ever truly set them free. The end was never really the end, not for them. It was just the beginning. If you found this story moving and want to see more gripping, emotional tales, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on the latest content. Your support means the world, and it helps us bring more stories to life. Thank you for being part of this journey.